Robin Dunbar, welcome to the How Humans Work podcast, and thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, great pleasure to be there.
I'm excited to talk with you about the origins of sociality. I'm excited to look at this issue of the season's theme of social cohesion and the work that you do and the work that you've done in your life, the books that you've written, in order to help us kind of get some insight and understand this dimension of our human nature. And that's accessing this ancient endorphin system, which you've
Yes.
talked
Yeah,
about, and all the layers of that. And then you were talking about the benefits or the health implications on the immune system, depression, and all those things. But we are starting now to get close back to this issue of time and the management of time and the amount of time we have and brain size, and that we have limited time, and this amazing leap humans do of grooming without contact,
Yes.
grooming through certain kinds of social interaction. So can we touch for a minute a little bit on that story of where, most primates are hanging out at the touch level, contact, the endorphin system, and what are some of the key things that brought us to where we are into our nature and our new social nature? Yeah.
Okay, so this is really what social grooming is all about, and of course, it is time consuming. Some of these species spend huge amounts of the time. The most social species of all the monkeys and apes that we've ever looked at spends something in the order of 20% of its waking day. It's a fifth of its day engaged in grooming. It's a phenomenal investment to make when it could be feeding, presumably. But it's a marker of how important these kinds of forms of social interaction are for primates. The problem with it is, the quality of the relationship you have depends on the time you invest in them. We know that's true of both monkeys and of humans. So humans' willingness, your friend's willingness to help you out or loan you stuff or come and do stuff with you is really directly proportional to the amount of time you've invested in them and that relationship in the immediate past. So much so that those 5 core friends, we often refer to these as the shoulders to cry on friends, because they're the people who, my test case here is, when you go and knock on their door and say, my world has fallen apart, will you come and sit me down, talk to me, come and have a beer, or give me a hug, or whatever it is you want to get you out of this big hole you're in. The test case is, will they drop the baby and come and help you out, right? And the baby, presumably, for most people, is the most precious thing they have. So if they're willing to put the baby down and let it scream and sort you out, then you must be very valuable to them. But they're only going to do that if you've invested a lot of time in building and maintaining that relationship. And if you don't believe me, just go out into the street right where you live, and the first stranger you see, throw your arms around him or her and say, my world has fallen apart, will you give me a hug? Right? Now, I'll bet you anything you like, anything you like, that what their response will be to get their cell phone out and phone either an ambulance or the police. But do that to one of those 5 shoulders to cry on friends and family, and of course they will do whatever is necessary, immediately without further thought. Less close friends will kind of go, bit busy at the moment, can I come round later, or do you want to make a diary slot or something like that? Too late. No, you want them to do it, deal with you now. So that those 5 friends we devote 40% of our total social time to, and that amounts to about somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes per day to each of them, not to all of them, to each of them. If you've got too big a family, do you sacrifice your family or do you sacrifice your friends? Which is an interesting game to get into. We maybe come back to that. But the point is, you have to invest very heavily in these relationships to really make them work. And the difference between your kind of intimate friends, this inner core of intimate friends and family, again, I emphasize that, it doesn't really matter whether they're friends or family, it's the relationship, is very different to the weaker friendships that you have, the more distant friendships, the just friends, as you might say, who you've known for a long time and you make an effort to keep up with, perhaps once a year, Christmas or something, give them a call, find out how they're doing, drop in on them perhaps. Those friends are very cheap to maintain. They probably only cost you about 20 seconds a day, which means, you just need a lot of days before you've got enough time to have a beer with them, basically. But, they're there for important social purposes because they provide your extended network. It gives you a lot of information about stuff going on. In the old days, at least to professors at Yale, so, do they know what they're talking about or not, we have to ask. But there's a very nice study which suggested that in the days before internet dating, 70% of us met our life partner through one of these members of our extended network. And the important thing about that probably was that introduction provided a guarantee. It's a bit like the sort of village matchmaker, they by introducing you to a prospective or somebody who turns out to become your prospective life partner, they're kind of standing surety for them, they won't do you down. They're decent people and all these kind of things. And there's an element of, trust in that sense, in those kind of relationships. That's probably why, so many of us found our prospective life partners in that way, through what amount to personal introductions. But I'm just showing my age here. Everybody does it on the internet now.
Apparently, I missed that window.
Yes, I know. That's what they
I've
all
been
say.
Yeah. All right. So humans, we have this thing. We have this sociality that's really unique, right? And we apply
it's
it in
unique in its quantity, numerically, as it were. The way we've managed to expand the size of our social world, and the scale of that is just to give you a feel for the differences. You do not get average group sizes for primate species that are bigger than about 50. That seems to be the limit, and it turns out that 50 people is about the limit of the size of group you can bond via the social grooming mechanism. It's not that you're grooming everybody. You're mostly grooming, again, this little inner core, but what you're doing is getting a kind of friends of a friends of friends kind of linkage. But it seems that kind of runs out of steam of creating, because what these friendships do is create not only a sense of trust, but a sense of obligation and reciprocity and so on, that allows them to stick together and come to your aid and so on. That kind of effect, it's a bit like a gravitational effect from the sun. Once you get too far out in the solar system, the gravitational effect is too low to have any.
Can we say it's fair that at the number 50, at 50 relationships, we can be cohesive at that level? Like there's enough connection to be cohesion, and once it starts getting bigger, it starts becoming more problematic.
Yes, well, that certainly is the case for monkeys and apes, right? And therefore, although occasionally you get bigger groups, these groups are very unstable, and usually they break up and split up and become smaller because they're just difficult for them to keep coherent and together. But it's also interesting that this size of 50 seems to be the limit on the number of people that we're happy to engage in physical contact with, right? Aside from just handshakes with strangers, if you like, but sort of beyond this 50 layer, everything is by and large a handshake and nothing more. But inside that 50 layer, you're happy for them to give you a hug when they meet you in the street, or give you a pat on the head, or a arm round a shoulder, or a pat on the leg when we're in the
I
middle
think
of a
in
conversation.
California we lead to hugging more than 50 people out here. We're a little bit more touchy-feely here on the West Coast.
I don't believe it. My grandmother was from California, and she was very stern.
Oh, was she? Okay.
But there's probably a good reason, because she actually went to California in, I think it was 1895, as a 5-year-old on the back of a covered wagon over the Sierras. This is serious stuff. So if you survived that as a 5-year-old, you got a very different.
And she told you those stories, and you got to hear those stories from your grandmother?
Yeah.
That's amazing. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. So, but this connection with 50 and what we're comfortable with, how is it that you're famous for the Dunbar's number of 150?
Okay. Yes.
So right. So help us get to that, between the 5 and the 15 and the 50 and the 150. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at the social groups of any primates, indeed many other species that have complex social systems, you think of the dolphin family, elephants, whatever. Many of the primates, like monkeys and apes that live in big groups, what you see is these very distinct structured layers, which have these inner core. If you look at individuals' relationship, they're inner core of 5 special friendships, then a group of 15, which includes the inner core of 5 sort of good friends, if you like, and then the 50 friends. And these layerings spread in humans continue out from there. So you've got another layer that runs out to about 150 of what we always describe as just friends. So, there are a lot of extended families sit in there, aunts and uncles and second cousins and the like, that, you've known a long time, a lot of old friends that you were at college with, but, you haven't seen for ages. But if you had the chance to meet up with them, you'd take the trouble to do it, and have an evening together or something, but you probably wouldn't see them again for another couple of years. They all sit in this outer circle, and it includes altogether about 150 people. So that includes all your intimate friends and family in the centre, as well as these more casual relationships, and that's what's known as Dunbar's number. It's the equivalent grouping size for humans to the group sizes that monkeys and apes live in, and that's underpinned by the size of our brain. The so-called social brain hypothesis, that size of group you live in correlates very, very strongly with the size of, particularly the smart end of your brain, the bit of the brain that allows you to do calculations, as it were, as
like
opposed to
the prefrontal cortex.
It's
kind
the
of
prefrontal cortex primarily. It's a bit bigger than that, but in fact, it's really quite a lot of the neocortex. Well, your neocortex is 80% of your total brain volume. This is the smart bit of the brain. That's why we can do Einstein's equations. As of course, I know you can. but well, he can. So humans.
One of us can.
One of us
can.
One of us can. But it's that big computer essentially that allows us to keep track of what's going on and manage our relationships. It allows us to know who's friends with who, and who's fallen out with who, and all these kind of things, and how to then respond to them. How do you tread that very tricky line in trying to be friendly to both people who now hate each other? It's that sense of the
or a divorce.
Skills,
yeah.
Skills of diplomacy, which of course are completely absent in the modern world, it seems. But
I want to talk about the modern world. I do want to talk about the modern world.
Okay.
I know we're getting there.
But the 150 then is our basic social unit, and it just appears once you realize that that's what the number is, it just turns up all over the place in all sorts of weird, strange contexts of human organization. The military organization of the military is structured around it, or at least armies, which are the bit that depends on bodies, as it were, as opposed to technology like the Air Force. But we're the boots on the ground people.
Let me just make this one point or ask this clarification point, which is humans behave this way without consciously thinking about it. It's not like we're going, oh, I have to do, this is my goal, or this is what I do. It's just our nature to be able to handle this range of relationships at these different layers, these nesting layers inside each other.
Essentially, yes. It is not to say, of course, the one big difference between us and everybody else in the animal kingdom is that we can aspire to much higher levels of calculation, if you like. So we're very good at, what our big brain allows us to do is actually to do a lot of strategic calculation and evaluate. Should I spend time with Jimmy or should I spend time with Susan?
Yeah.
And we do it, there's no question. I mean, some people are very
Who's going to help my
scheming.
endorphin system more today?
Some people are very scheming. And dare I say it, the most scheming place you ever engage in this is when you're courting.
Say more about that. Say more about that aspect of courting. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be fair, courtship is actually a very good model for what goes on in our choice of friends, right? The objective is slightly different, obviously, but essentially the process of choice that we go through when we choose our best friends, because we're taking just 4 or 5 people out of the 6 billion that exist on the planet at the moment, and treating them very differently.
I'm sorry, it's 8.2 now.
Oh God, it gets worse. Because the big problem with all this is simply the size of the group. It's this that has caused us to have to discover, and most of it they're, with the possible exception of laughter, they're not necessarily genetically selected for components of our biology. We've just found ways of exploiting existing biology that's there for other purposes. But this social toolkit that we use in social bonding, laughter, singing, dancing, and all these kind of things, right? What we've had to do we've been under this pressure to increase the size of the groups that we live in order to cope with the environmental threats and stresses that we have to deal with. The bigger the group, the mechanisms for creating the bonding start to become ineffective. So social grooming works very nicely when the groups are small, but it runs out of steam once groups get above 50. It just won't work. You need something else. So what we seem to have done is, over the course of the last couple of million years, at least during the course of human evolution, added in sequentially these other activities. Laughter is the old one that probably evolved about 2 million years ago, and it got us out of the 50 layer, got us up to a slightly bigger grouping, and then probably around about 500,000 years ago, singing and dancing kicked in. There's very good anatomical evidence to suggest that now. And probably some of the other things like feasting and storytelling are much more recent, maybe appeared only with our own species about 200,000 years ago. So you've got these sort of almost glass ceilings that trap you into smaller group sizes. And if you need to have bigger groups, you've got to find a way of breaking through the glass ceiling. So that's been our story of evolution as a species, is finding ways around these blockages, as it were, to get bigger groups. And those, and that's allowed us to create these rather diffuse, weak relationships that give us these group size in the order of 150. But we know more people than that. There are several more layers beyond the Dunbar number. At 500 you get a layer of people you'd think of as acquaintances. They're people well, you work with them, you'd have a beer with them now and again, but you never invite them home. That's the kind of test case, as it were. Then there's a layer of people whose faces you can put a name to. So absolutely all of us has Donald Trump in our 1500 layer, whether you like it or not. you know, you would know
Yeah.
him if you saw him in the street. You would recognize him instantly, and you'd rush up to him, I'm sure, and clap him on the back and say, "Donald, come and have a beer." And you'd probably
We need to
be
help your
greeted.
endorphin system, Donald.
Yes, the difference here now is he wouldn't know who you are.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, in his case, he's a good politician. He'd probably, behave as though he'd known you since kindergarten. That's the test of a good politician, probably. But in reality, he has no idea who you are. Right? So it's a one-way relationship. You know who they are, but they don't know who you are. And then the outermost layer of all is at 5,000. We didn't discover that. Some psychophysicists interested in memory capacity for faces discover that. It's at 5,000. You can differentiate up to 5,000 faces as to whether you've seen them before or not. But you don't know. I mean, obviously the 1,500 you can put a name to, but the sort of whatever it is, 3,500. The rest that make up the 5,000 layer are completely anonymous. So, but you've seen that face before somewhere, right? It's not a stranger. You might have seen it in the newspaper or on television, perhaps, or walking down the street, but you don't know anything about them at all. But beyond that, there is nothing. There is nothing except strangers. That seems to be an absolute kind of social limit. So you have these gradations. If you like, our social world, you might say, consists of 5,000 people, but it's layered in these gradations of increasingly small numbers, but more intensely known and loved relationships that, as you get closer in towards you, become more and more important to you, and they're longer lasting. They're people you've known for a long time, have these more intimate personal relationships with.
And we get better health benefits and positive feelings by having that being more solid, stable. Yeah. Right. So we should be spending more time there in the proportion of our life. Yeah.
Yes. And the issue here is, I mean, the sociologist Granovetter many years ago drew a distinction between strong and weak ties, as he called them, in our social networks, and that distinction really maps very nicely onto this. So your strong ties are the ones that really matter to you. They're those in a couple of circles, maybe 15, maybe 50 people, most definitely the 5 in the inner core. They're the ones that really will come and help you out when you need it. They'll come round when you're moving house and give you a hand for free. They're not going to ask for payment. They're doing it out of love for you, and they know jolly well you would pay them back one day. And they're prepared to wait happily. But the further out you go, then through to 150, people will do it. They might be a little bit more grudging and say, "Well, look, can we do it next week? Because I'm a bit busy. I'm playing golf this week." Whereas, within the 50, they'll drop the golf and come and help you. The people in that sort of 50 out to 150 layer, they'll do it, but it's a little bit harder work for them to be willing to do it. But once you're beyond the 150, everything becomes very transactional. So people out there will, by and large, do things for you only if you promise to pay them back in some form. Either pay them some money for their time, or take them out to dinner maybe for their effort, or at least say, next time you're digging your garden out, just let me know and I'll come round and help you out with it. So it's those kind of reciprocity. But that 150 really demarcates the difference between people who will certainly help you out, and won't expect to be paid back. They do it because of their relationship with you, as it were.
The interest in social capital, the connection, right? That we have this kind of
exactly.
shared economy. Yeah. Okay. Great. Excellent. Okay. Well, that makes sense, and it's a beautiful rendition of what are the underpinning drives, motivations, behaviors, and capacities that are in our social life. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the antisocial aspect of life that's in today's world, but I think maybe before we get there, I mentioned 1960, planet was 3 billion people. Today, I looked it up this morning, it's 8.2 billion people.
Frightening.
It's incredible, as I've been preparing for this podcast conversation with you, I started to realize this theme I'm working with. How do we have a cohesive self? That even to think that somehow we could be cohesive at 8.2 billion people is not really the right way of thinking about it. It's not a realistic expectation, and there's actually no capacity in us to maybe to relate with the ideas about that, but actual relationship management time, it's impossible.
Yep.
Right.
Well,
So what do we do in this? Go ahead, say it.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem is once you're beyond a certain level in these circles, as it were, the relationships are either so anonymous or so thin that there's no sense of obligation to the other person. Although you're probably not calculating it like this, consciously, at least at some level, subconsciously, you're kind of making a trade-off between, well, if I come and help you, I can't do X, Y, and Z, which, I need to do, or I promised somebody else I would do. Our time is not infinite, is the bottom line, and that it creates these limitations. Now, we've been quite good as a species in kind of overcoming that by extrapolating the mechanisms we use for creating friendships into creating what you might think of as mega groups, super groups. And the baseline example of that is the tribe. So it turns out that this layer at 1,500, which kind of, is people whose faces you can put a name to. Don't know much about most of them, but beyond that, but you can put a name to. That turns out to be the typical size of small scale society tribe. So hunter-gatherers, think of the Plains Indians of the US and Canada, South American Indians in the Amazon, hunter-gatherers in Africa and Asia. The typical size of the tribe was 1,500, very consistently. Now, in order to keep that together as a unit, because the problem is literally boils down to, you're walking through the jungle there, and somebody steps out onto the path in front of you, and you have to make an instantaneous decision. Do you carry on walking up to them, clap them on the back and say, "Hi, how are you doing?" Or do you run like hell? Because if you don't, they're going to get you, right? It's a jungle out there. We're talking back in the past, I mean, it's still a jungle now, but it was, much more serious of a jungle, let's say several thousand years ago. And, the way we solved that problem was to create virtual supergroups on the basis of superficial cues which allow us to recognize members of our tribe at a distance. And these cues are often represented in the way we dress, the kind of clothes we wear, our hairstyles, the jewelry we wear, the weapons we carry, the decorations we put on our pots and pans, all these kind of things.
Subcultures,
Yeah. So we
Hell's
still do
Angels or people who ride motorbikes, and I'm a Manchester City fan, so
you can see, we still do it. Goths, particular, Teddy Boys of the 1950s, the rock, rock and roll Teddy Boys. They all had a style, and even the way they walk. The way you ride a horse or whatever it is. Instantly I know whether you belong to my club or not, which is essentially what it is. Although the risk on that is it's always possible to cheat. You might imitate my Elvis Presley quiff in my hairstyle with the intention of getting inside my defenses and then, robbing me of everything. So what we rely on finally is what you say when you open your mouth. And dialect is one of the best markers we have of do you belong to my tribe or not. It is incredibly good because dialects are very, very small scale. In England, native English speakers, you can place to within 20 miles of where they were born the moment they open their mouth, because the dialects are so small scale. And the size of that is actually about a tribe size, the area that's covered turns out to be about the size of. In small scale societies, ethnographic societies, hunter-gatherers and so on, the definition of a tribe is the people who speak a particular language, right? It's a linguistic definition. And the word they use to name themselves is almost always the word for humans.
Yes.
People.
I'm reading a book about that right now. Yes, I'm reading a book about indigenous people of Venezuela. And
Yes.
it's their mythologies, but they're doing a little history, and all of the tribes in that little zone, they describe themselves as the true humans.
That's right. And this is equally true up in North America. Most of the kind of names for the Eskimo group, occupying the Arctic Circle up in Canada, their tribal names just mean, us, people, humans. Simple as that. And it's true all over the world. So that's a very, very good marker because, I can shout to you down the path and get you to say something. And, obviously it comes out as garbled gobbledygook, and you're not in my tribe, and I can hightail it. But the closer in we get, what we start doing is probing, because the other thing that then we rely on is, do you have the same knowledge that I do of the world? Do you see the world in the same way? So, and these are important for friendships. We actually evaluate our friendships on these criteria. It's what we call the 7 pillars of friendship, and they're like 7 dimensions. They're like a supermarket barcode of who you are and what you like and how you think the world works. And, so there are things like, dialect it happens to be one of them, but there are things like your hobbies and interests, or your moral and political and religious views, these kind of things, your taste in music, your in particular, and your sense of humor. And what we do is we probe. So, your tribe has a particular profile because it sees the world in a particular way. It has kind of moral, ethical rules about how people should behave, right? And so, I kind of listen to what you say and pick up these little cues and go, oh, yes, actually, he's on my wavelength, give him a bit more time and let's build on this one. And we do that. We've shown that people are doing that with phone calls, analyzing just simply nothing but how often they call. We can predict how long a friendship will last, a new friendship. So when you see in the call log a new number appears, we can predict how long that number will stay there and be called before it disappears again, and also which layer of friendship it will sit in on the basis of the frequency of calling in the first 4 to 6 weeks after they first met. Right? If you think about it, this is, the modern world, well, last century's modern world of the cell phone, but we kind of do it face to face. If you meet somebody new, you introduce somebody new, you make a big effort. If you think they're potentially interesting, you kind of make a big effort to kind of meet up lots, come around, have dinner, let's go out, let's go and have, one evening. And you kind of invest a lot of time, and then you're kind of assessing where they lie. And then after a period of time, and apparently it just takes about 4 weeks or so, you've assessed where they lie on the 7 pillars of friendship, these 7 dimensions. If you share 6 or 7 of these pillars with them, common interests, they will end up in your kind of inner circle of five. But if you only share one, let's say, I don't know, you're both tiddlywinks aficionados, or something like that, or an interest in antique cars, or some obscure 1960s pop band from California, then that we're talking about a 150 circle friendship. And so at that point, you just stop seeing them so often. Once you've realized where they should lie, you put them in a bucket, and you only see them as often as is appropriate for that layer. It's really amazing.
It's amazing. And as I listen to you, sometimes I feel like you're talking to me, and it's to me an indication of how much the information, the knowledge you're talking about, it actually applies. I'm like, oh yeah, he's,
Sure.
I feel connected in my life. I can see I'm having flashes of these moments in these relationships as you're talking about this layering or this nesting and this evaluation that we do kind of semi-consciously. We're not doing that. It's just happening, right?
Somewhere deep down, there's some evaluation going on in the depths of your brain, but it's not done consciously, particularly. What's interesting is we kind of often reflect on it after the fact, and we go, oh yeah, now I know why I was such a good friend. We shared so much in common. Usually that's way down the line.
Do you call that bottom-up thinking? And it's close to intuition, right? So there's kind of an intuitive sense, and then later, much later, the comprehension comes online.
Yes, and then at that point we kind of justify what happened in the past. We did it right, and now I say, okay, yeah, I realize why I did it right, because.
Yes, we insert meaning. I understand that idea and that concept, but I was also wanted to make the point that it's also why the second half of life is interesting, right? Because a lot of stuff that we've lived through becomes clear to us, starts to show itself, right? We start to understand it in a way we didn't as we were living through it.
That's right.
I want to go back to this mass society. So you're talking about mega groups, tribes, subcultures would maybe be another way of talking about how we can create a larger sense of identity in the mix. But I think you also write about like religion, laws, rituals, institutions as a kind of, I don't know if they're a container or they actually activate the endorphin system, or they just keep everything manageable enough so we can have those small endorphin, high value relationships. What's your sense of that?
I think this goes back to the fact that you have this dual mechanism, dual process mechanism that underpins friendships in primates, monkeys and apes, and ourselves, where you have these two systems going on in the brain. One of them is this raw feels component, the endorphin system. The other is this kind of cognitive, more conscious, thoughtful component, if you like. And even in primates, you can see that what happens is the closer, more intimate relationships are dealt with through the endorphin system, and the more distant ones are dealt with sometimes just through vocalizations, if you like, talking at a distance, but handled much more cognitively. And we do the same. So our closer friends, we often end up, we don't talk to them, we just happy to hang out with them. You don't need to say anything. It's just being there in the moment that's important, right? And they often say this with romantic relationships with couples. To begin first few years, great deal of talking goes on, probing, doing things, and then you go into this long period where it's very comfortable and settled, and at that point, conversation stops. Nothing to be said. It's just being there. But the conversational component and the evaluation, the cognitive component, then becomes much more important. And this is how we've managed to create, to jump out of, if you like, even the tribal system, once we started living in settlements, and in particular in sort of about 8,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. and gradually started to form, villages and then towns and then cities and city-states and then kingdoms and so on, up to the nation states we have. We've been exploiting the same system, and that system is this kind of shared knowledge. There's a bunch of folk tales we all know, right? If you're an American, you know who Billy the Kid is, and I can just say Billy the Kid, and if I know when you look blankly at me, well, you're not American, that's for sure, right? Every nationality has that kind of either historical figures or their folk tales, Cinderella, all these kind of things that are part of the fabric of who we are, and it allows us to have almost infinitely large communities in the sense of nations and nation states. And of course, then there's all sorts of other stuff that has to do with the laws we accept. The myths of the foundation of the society. The founding fathers and the Constitution and all these things that everybody learns in school, and it kind of identifies you. And it, the games we play, do you know that I'm, since I'm not good enough on my baseball to do it, and nor on my American football to do it, I'll resist. But we'll do cricket because that completely foxes Americans, I know for sure. But when I refer to the bowler bowling a googly and silly mid-on catching it, you can look blankly at me just the way you're doing because you have no idea what I'm talking about. But I can tell you a very large proportion of British people, well, the Scots don't really play cricket, but the English and the Welsh do. They know exactly what you're talking about. And of course, we share that with, let's say, the whole of the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Ceylon, Bangladesh, Australians, the New Zealanders, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the Caribbean islands, the cricketing nations. They would know exactly what I'm... And that kind of gives me an instant clue is, are you in my wider tribe or not? And those kind of mechanisms are extremely, they're almost ethereal and theoretical. There's no meaning to it, but I know that you're in my group, and therefore I feel very well disposed to you. And then we do things like, we have flags and we have national anthems, and you know how to sing the national anthem, and you know how to describe your tribe, and you have all the sort of little ceremony that goes on every day, every morning at school in the US, pledging the allegiance, and all these things that then mark you out because everybody knows what the little ritual is. Even 50 years later, when they've grown up and become more sensible, instantly they know what that is. If they see somebody engaged in that ritual in the distance, they must be American. So these kind of little signals are extremely good. And in the same vein, religion seems to have played a very important role as well in this context, and this probably explains why religions fragment as easily as languages fragment. Because the issue with language is nobody ever comments on it, and I find this very, very strange. Why do we have so many different languages? There's about 8,000 languages on the planet at the moment, living languages that somebody speaks. Plus, God knows how many that are now dead, of course. But how come we don't have one language? If language is meant to have evolved to allow us to communicate with each other and engage in cooperative activities and solve problems together, how on earth can it possibly be the case that we have so many languages? Well, the answer is very simple. It's to allow us to differentiate to our different tribes, right? I recognize you instantly because you speak French, or you speak German, or you speak Saskatchewan, whatever it might be, some obscure language or other. And the same with religions. Religions do exactly the same thing. You might go, well, if religion is what it says it is, as we usually understand it, as the ultimate truth. How come there are so many? And the answer is very simple. We like to differentiate our religions in order to differentiate our tribes. So tribes and religions and languages all go together very, very tightly in the ethnographic world, and they still do with us. It's just that religions have this capacity to form very big groups. So, it's an amazingly powerful mechanism which allows people who have no connection whatsoever, they don't even speak the same language, they don't even come from the same part of the world, they share nothing culturally or even biologically in common, in terms of sort of close relationships, to suddenly go, oh, you're a brother religionist. I shall come and help you out immediately. Right, and some religions have been very successful. Obviously, the big ones, particularly so. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., 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 Sikhism. But even you look at any of these religions, how fragmented they are. Look at what happened with Christianity. It's split within 10 years of the death of Christ. It had split into two factions. There's the Jerusalem faction and the essentially the Greek faction, who wanted to go out and proselytize. Most of the disciples, the 12 disciples, wanted to stay in Jerusalem and be a sect of Judaism. They didn't want to have any truck with these weird Romans and Greeks and other people out there. But St. Paul, came along and said, no, we've got to go and proselytize the world. And so, at the end of the day, the Jerusalem church disappeared, and what we got left with was actually Paulinity. It's not Christianity. It's St. Paul's version of Christianity. But within a matter of 100 years, it was already starting to fragment into factions and heretical sects. Well, at least they were heretical according to one lot.
Right.
And of course, sometimes they split and were very successful. You think of the Eastern Orthodox versus the Roman Catholic split, the Protestants splitting away from the Roman Catholics in Northern Europe, in whenever it was the 1500s or so, and surviving and becoming denominations or religions in their own right, as it were. And you see that in every single religion. Buddhism has almost as many different versions and sects as Christianity does. Judaism's the same. Islam is the same. Within 30 years of the death of Muhammad, it split into two major groups, the Sunnis and the Shias. And the Shias have got on splitting into smaller and smaller factions ever since. So it's just like looking at language evolution, and language evolution, as I say, is all about identifying your little local community, but your little local community on a bigger scale than we can know personally. So this is your super tribe, essentially, and it works very well. But
but it's prone to fractions.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to be very prone to fragmenting all the time. It's almost like you have bubbling up from underneath these little cults and sects, all of which are based around charismatic leaders with a particular idea. They've had a particular vision, or they've been given a particular message from the deity, and they get a few followers around them, and whether it survives or not partly depends on whether it becomes well established and outgoing. A lot of these little cults and sects just die out with the death of the founder. Some become very successful. I mean, you think of the Mormons, for example, in the US, starting out as a little group of people somewhere up there in New England somewhere, and now they are a state, as you might say.
Yeah.
Well, an international state, of course, as well, too. But, Utah is the Mormon state. It's that
pretty much.
that
Pretty
big.
much.
And what's interesting about this is how religion manages to keep the lid on the stresses and frictions that arise from living close together. And
Yeah.
I did an analysis with Rich Sosis, who's an anthropologist from Massachusetts, I think, is where he is, of utopian cults and communities in the American Midwest in the 19th century. Now, what's interesting about these, these are these guys, they went off in the middle of the Midwest and they set up a little commune and they were self-sufficient and they tried to live a good life or whatever it was they were doing. Some of them survived and some of them didn't. Now, it turns out that the ones that survived, and the ones you still know about, the Shakers, the Mormons, the Hutterites, etc., 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 were all religious, based communes. They had a religious theme to them, and were very strongly religious. The ones that died out very quickly were all secular. So they were ideological. They were kind of hippie communes of the 1850s, right? And you won't. I'm sure you've never heard of the New Harmony community.
No, and it doesn't sound like it would be from the 1850s.
1830.
Sounds like it's from the 1960s. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And they usually died out because, they broke up eventually, because usually what happened was the founder ran off with either the money, the collective money,
or the women.
Or the women, exactly. Right? Whereas that was, in the religious communes, religion held a lid on that and just if you like, just kind of made people behave better, made them more tolerant of each other, enough to keep the community together. And the difference is, the average size at foundation for secular ones was 50, and their average duration, how long they lasted, was 10 years.
Wow.
7 years. 7 years, right? The average size at foundation for religious communities was 150, and their average duration was 70 years. And some of them are still going strong, obviously. And we know them, well from the modern world. But, they lasted 10 times longer.
There's those numbers again. Let me try and summarize what I think you just walked me through in your historical account of nations and religion and Paul and Islam and all that, and American small groups of religious movements in the 19th century. I think what you're saying is big mythological storytelling, religious narratives are able to hold masses together beyond the 5,000 person tribal limit in some pretty amazing ways.
Yes.
While simultaneously inside that, subgroups that tend to run in these familiar numbers of 50 or 150 and probably have a lot more endorphin rich experience because they have a charismatic leader and they have all these positive pain relieving movement and feelings come in and then undermine and fracture that overall structure. And this is a way to talk about how evolution has been moving through the centuries. Still these two different ways of adapting to population, but reverting to these old sub movements that kind of cut it at the big cohesiveness.
Yeah. And what's interesting in this context, and particularly with the religious movements, because it's most clear there. I mean, I'm not promoting religion here. It doesn't seem to matter what you believe as long as it kind of has a spiritual dimension to it, which is the kind of weird component, if you like. But if you look at most of the big religions, the world religions as we have them now, Christianity, Islam, etc., 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 the hierarchy spends a lot of time worrying about these little sects and cults bubbling up from underneath. They're house church size, basically. They're little groups of people who get together, and very often their theology is deeply suspect, and therefore the hierarchy does not like it. And of course, the hierarchy have had very bad press over the last in Christianity, well, and in Islam over the last 2,000 years, in trying to suppress the cults and so on. And clearly, there's been this tension there, where by almost as a natural process, as in the evolution of dialects within languages, people in a little community just start speaking differently. The next generation always speaks slightly different to the previous generation, which is why parents are always complaining that their damn kids can't speak properly. Not like
Low
us,
key.
Not like us. We did it right, despite the fact that our parents complain about
Yes.
the way we spoke. But the tension here is, how do you keep a big community together? A ginormous thing. It might be a world religion with a billion followers. Let's say Catholicism at the moment,
Yep.
to take a case in point, or it might be a nation state, a country. How do you keep, the US coherent? Why hasn't the US fragmented?
That's why I'm doing this season. I was hoping you were going to answer this for me. What do you have, Robin?
Well, the short answer is you need a bit of top-down discipline, which is what the religious hierarchy try to do, impose their will to keep everybody on the theological straight and narrow. But you need a little bottom-up structuring as well. And at that level, I think the US has kind of got, I don't say it's a perfect solution, but they've got half the solution for sure. And that is the fact you have a state structure, right? Right. So the states have their own independence. They don't all have to toe the line and behave or speak, dare I say it, the same way as everybody else. They can have their own laws, they can raise their own taxes and all that kind of thing. And then you have, the federal system putting it together. And I think those kind of federal structures work best. You see it in Switzerland, which on a much, much smaller scale, the cantons are basically the local city, and they are completely independent. Each canton runs itself, and then you have a federal system. We have the same system in the United Kingdom. That's why it's called the United Kingdom. We have 4 different countries here, 6 languages, and I don't mean any of the languages that have been brought in by immigrants in the last 100 years. We have 6 native languages that are spoken on these islands that are mutually unintelligible. And we have 2 legal systems. Scotland has a different legal system to England. It has a different educational system. The 4-year university structure as the standard thing that you have in the US comes from the Scottish system, where they have 4 years. In England, it's 3 years. They have a different religion. The state religion in England is Anglicanism, obviously. The state religion in Scotland is Presbyterianism, it's Calvinist Presbyterianism, Church of Scotland. So you've got these big cultural differences, linguistic differences, but it all kind of works because they have that, and always have had, that degree of autonomy. England has never when there have been revolts and revolutions, they've tried desperately to stamp out what they thought was the culture that produced it. But by and large, they've always operated very tolerantly in allowing the local countries, the 4 countries, to do it their way, their own way, as it were, and kept those things going. And that's created a sense of, we're different, but we're part of a unity. And that's what you see in America. How long that will last, of course, is another matter, because in the end, all giant empires collapse. But
I don't know if you look forward, you look in the future, but I really appreciate and understand where you're coming from with a little bit of top-down mythology, strength, cognitive holding, and a little bottom-up local community, small numbers that people can relate with and feel good in life about. When you look forward, if you do, assuming you do you see just more of this with different iterations, or do you see humanity and the human story radically changing in some way? like it has in the past?
Yeah, this is a very pertinent question, but it's also very tricky, and one should always be a bit careful of making prognostications about the future. I think famously in biology, it's impossible to predict evolution because it's so circumstantial in the direction it takes off in, serendipitous in some way. But I think what we do have to worry about is just how big the world has become, how many people are crowded onto this planet. And it's putting pressures in places that are clearly beginning to become intolerable. I mean, you're kind of lucky in the US, at least kind of west of the Appalachians and the like, in that you've got lots of land still. Okay, some of it probably is not ideal for living in the Nevada desert. It's a bit tricky, but most of it is still pretty good land, and you can expand and take more population. But I'm afraid Europe, and certainly western side of Europe, is seriously overpopulated. Less so the eastern side, but and then you have to, and of course, the place like Japan, where you're kind of practically standing on people's shoulders, the population and India, the population density is so high. It's very difficult to prevent frictions occurring and the thing sort of falling apart in chaos when you're in those kind of very, very large mega communities. One has to be hopeful on the grounds that humans have managed to survive these catastrophes many times before and found by finding a solution. The trouble is the solution usually just allows the population to get bigger for a while, and then you're back where you started. But it's getting pretty crowded, and I think the biggest worry has to be that climate warming, irrespective of what the cause is, it's clearly in part a natural cycle anyway. We know that well enough, but we may well be making it worse. But even without us making it worse, we're probably in the process of heading in this direction anyway. It's sort of natural switch from cold to warm cycles with the ice ages. If the planet gets 3-5 degrees warmer, most of the central tropics either side of the equator is going to be uninhabitable, and except at high altitudes. Now, they are particularly densely inhabited areas, so there's going to be a lot of people wanting to move south and north, and of course there isn't much land south of the equator. Most of it is north of the equator, as it happens, for whatever reasons. Well, at least until Antarctic gets ice free, we can start colonizing that. But there's going to be much more pressure of migration on northern hemisphere countries as people are forced to move. Not just out of Africa and South Asia, but Central America is going to Central America and the top end of South America, and probably the bottom end of the US, Texas, New Mexico kind of area is just going to get less and less habitable, unless you are prepared to spend a lot of money on water from piping it down from somewhere else. And clearly there comes a point where that becomes either impossible to do or just too expensive to do. It's not worth doing it. And so we are, it's probably not going to be in our lifetimes, but we probably ought to be doing some thinking and planning about how to deal with this in the long run. And I'm afraid politicians are not very good at doing that. They're too focused on the next election most of the time. But we're not going to leave our grandchildren or great grandchildren may be in great shape if we don't find some way of dealing with this and better than we've been doing so far.
Yeah. Sounds like you have some really deep concerns about the trajectory you're on.
Well, it's not good. I mean, the problem is, you can argue about whether we have caused it by burning too much fossil fuels or stuff or not. I mean, the reality is these cycles have been going on for a very long time. Right? Every 40,000 years, the polarity of the Earth switches, and the North Pole becomes the South Pole. We're still a long way from that, but there is going to come a point when it's going to screw up a lot of the GPS systems, and aeroplanes are going to get confused and lost. These natural cycles, there are lots of them of varying length. They're celestial cycles, depending on the influence of the other planets and the sun, and the Earth's trajectory around the sun, all sorts of stuff like that. And they pile up to produce these periods of deep ice age. I mean, really seriously deep ice age, or very, very hot periods. The ice ages have come and gone in and out over the last 500,000 years, but they were kind of small beer, really, compared with some of the extraordinary changes in climate and environment that have happened before that. The life on Earth has sort of introduced a stabilizing effect by pumping things like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere a bit, which kind of provided a bit of a shelter from some of the sun's rays and stuff that have produced some of these cycles and climate cycles in the past. But it's not a complete solution. You only need a stray asteroid to upset everything, which is what happened.
Yeah, we can't control that one, but but I appreciate the reflection on the greater forces we're dealing with, and somehow right now, even though those seem really impossible, I feel hopeful, and I've appreciated. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think we have to be optimistic because humans. If you look at the history of human evolution, what comes across is how smart we have been at finding solutions to problems. The problem is, do we recognize it? And I have the same view of the digital world. I always think the techies that design the internet and social media and stuff are really good at producing solutions, providing they know what the problem is that they're trying to solve, right? And that's nearly always the difficulty because they don't recognize the problems are not their bread and butter. It's not what they do or think about. They just play with computer code and have fun, if you like. But it just needs somebody from the outside to say, okay, actually, no, what humans really do and what we really need to have be facilitated is, I don't know, social media that is even better aligned to the process of communal bonding in some way. And once they realize what the problem is, I do think they're very good at finding solutions to it. And in general, if you look back in the past, I mean, in the early 1700s, people were very exercised about the fact that the population of Europe, in that particular case, was expanding faster than its capacity to feed itself. Right? So this is the Malthusian catastrophe. And the Reverend Thomas Malthus wrote this incredible book showing mathematically that, there was going to be Armageddon and a lot of starving people. But within a generation, we'd figured out how to produce crops and, farm animals that were much, much more productive for the land. They used the land in much more efficient ways. So the new crops of wheat and barley and stuff, and the turnips and Swedes and those kind of carrots, those kind of things, big breeding programs that went on, and that solved the problem for a while.
Uh-huh.
But none of these solutions are complete nirvana. They're not going to last forever. They just keep you going till you hit the next glass ceiling, and the glass ceilings are all about population size. There's no question. The worrying thing about it is, and this come out very nicely, work that was done down at the Santa Fe Institute down there in New Mexico some years ago, showing that the rate at which new patents are filed is declining. Right? Fewer and fewer patents are being, and what this means is it's getting harder to figure out what the next clever thing is. Right? The design of technology is, we've done the easy ones. All that are left are the difficult ones to do, and they're the ones that probably matter. And it's the same with medicines. It's getting harder and harder to figure out the new designs for vaccines and things like that, for the new diseases that are appearing in the world. And it's that kind of race against the Grim Reaper, if you like. Can we beat him to it by being inventive fast enough? And the worry is that eventually, at some point, we'll just get overwhelmed because we just can't solve the problem. Unless populations stabilize, if populations in the world stabilize and preferably come down a bit from where they are, then things will be okay. But
Alas, here we are. This is our dilemmas, huh?
we're still smiling, so there's
Yeah,
that's good.
it is good. It is good. It's been amazing, the wealth of information, knowledge, and perspective you have. It's been a real treat to listen to you and understand these dynamics, from the endorphin system to primate social systems, and to how that all translate into what we're dealing with society today. And even look at history and look at the large organizational processes that are happening there. So I can't thank you enough. It's been fantastic. I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on the show today, Robin.
It's been a great pleasure, and I have to say, this is what makes science, and science, I use the term broadly to cover all the humanities as well, such fun to do. The world we live in is a fascinating place. Go out there and investigate it.
Yes, yes.
Very good. It's been a pleasure.